So external religious practice is attractive, beautiful even, because it takes us through important routines that regulate our sense of self and even have quite practical implications like ensuring physical cleanliness and mental health. On their own, when this practice doesn't flow out of our identity in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, it's not based in faith, and the external is primary. Religion, whether it's the contemplation, the miracles, the sacrifices, the cleanliness, is for show. Briefly, with regard to miracles, I remembered that Moses' miracles were replicated by the Egyptian magicians. The magicians were able to counterfeit 3 of the 10 signs. Aaron's staff turned into a snake, water was turned into blood, frogs were summoned. After that, the magicians acknowledged that Moses' miracles were done by the finger of God. Maybe the magician's power was evil. Maybe it was, as magicians' tricks often are, sleight of hand. So the James passage that we read today had me thinking about different expressions of faith. Traditional meditation, meaningful contemplation, counterfeit charismania, intimate, miraculous faith against the odds. So it's an adventure to find out what's real. It's an adventure to live out faith, and it takes courage. It's easy to go with the most polished story. So personally, I'm drawn to seek out and emulate faith that is thoughtful, coherent, that transforms the individual life and terraforms the nature of reality. So it's important to know one's principles. That's key, because you can find yourself responding to things that happen in the moment and then getting lost doing that. So for instance, when questions come about faith, it's important to know one's foundational principles and then to relate to those foundational principles. So for instance, the atheist might argue, there are worms that burrow into children, and how could a loving God allow this? And use this example as a reason against faith, and then arrive at the conclusion that God doesn't exist because of the tremendous amount of suffering there is in the world. Alternatively, the devout person of faith in Jesus might respond, people have found a cure to worms whose sole life cycle is to burrow into children's eyes and blind them. And as Jesus said, this has happened to show God's glory. So I've spent a fair amount of time in my work researching human psychological development, in part to understand why people don't do what's healthy, and also how people develop and maintain health behavior. So it's been fascinating to see how individual psychology develops dynamically in relation to the context. A psychoanalyst, Donald Winnicott, explored the importance of play in children's early development. He and others have emphasized the importance of play. But one example that stands out is the importance of the child crawling over the mother or father or caregiver's body. This exploration is both physical and psychological. Since reading that, I've looked forward to this experience with my own children. Zoe crawls over me and Shelley. She's fallen asleep lying on my chest, and Zoe often touches our faces, exploring the details with her hands. On occasion, she's fallen asleep while touching our faces, and it's an incredibly intimate experience. Through this experience, Zoe is developing what's called interiority, a psychological landscape, mapping our bodies and our psychology. She will introject our psychology and behavior and build her psychology on these early experiences. And in some ways, the attention she gets from us is foundational in building her interior world. This will help to deal with the inevitable stresses and challenges and traumas that she will face. So we're well acquainted with the idea and practice of exercise, gradually applying increasing pressure to muscles through aerobic activity like running or cycling, or anaerobic exercise like lifting weights, which increases our strength and fitness. Similarly, gradually applying pressure psychologically and spiritually increases character. So in the James reading, James speaks about genuine faith. In the portion of the chapter that we didn't read, he says to his listeners, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face various trials." Why? Because trials produce patient endurance, making you complete and whole. In other words, it produces good character. Faith needs to be and will inevitably be tested. The testing will produce varying degrees of faithfulness and character. And here's where early experiences and models, past and present, good and bad, can influence us. Having models that we can emulate can serve us well when we face trials and traumas. While I was too young to recall much of it, I watched my parents build genuine faith in themselves and in their community in the midst of turmoil. This was in the 80s and 90s. There were always courageous people about, people who, despite the storms, trials, the betrayal, personal failing, errors in judgment, the tests, the battering, they come out generous, faithful, able to offer their experience as a gift to others. And it's worth focusing on those people and emulating them. As we grow, we have increasing agency to choose our experiences and how those experiences influence us, from resentment to generosity. Resentment leads to unfaithfulness and counterfeit faith, and generosity is born out of intimate faith. So just like we subject ourselves to physical exercise, subjecting ourselves to psychological pressure, difficult experiences, will build the ability to produce flourishing in the midst of barrenness, light in darkness, meaning out of trauma, faithfulness out of betrayal. Marriage is a practical example, and I've heard that anyone married for any amount of time will have experienced testing, and that testing will show who you truly are. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. Marriage can show how terrible and in need of salvation you are, how loved and endowed with grace you are. And integrating those two produces good character. Father, open our eyes.